Menu and settings. Let's go through the menu and talk about some settings that I like to use. You may use different settings depending on your use. First, turn on the camera with the power button. Let's take a look at the main screen. We can see a lot of info here. Don't worry, I won't go over everything, but I'll point out things that I think are important. In the upper left-hand corner, we see that we have 2 media cards inserted and that we are ready to record on card A. We also see that in our current XF AVC setting, we have 68 minutes of record time on each card. Below that, we can see that our zoom lens is currently at 46mm in manual focus mode. We also see that we are shooting in C-Log 2. Our white balance is set to daylight. Our lens is set to f2.8. Our base ISO is set to 800. Our ISO is set to 800 as well. We are in 180-degree shutter mode. We can see our audio meter. We are shooting 4K, 4096 by 2160, YCC 422, 10-bit video. We are being powered by DCN, not battery. Our time code is in the upper right corner. We are shooting 23.98 frames per second, and we are currently in standby, meaning we are not recording. That's a lot of helpful info on one home screen. To open the menu on the screen, simply press the menu button on the back of the camera. To navigate around the menu and change settings, I'll use the joystick, the select dial, the set button, and the cancel button when necessary. The first menu is camera setup, and it has 8 pages. I like to set my iris increment to 1/3 stop. It's easier to fine-tune in that mode than it is at half stop. I'll make sure I turn extended ND range on. For shutter mode, I like to set this to angle and use 180 degrees most of the time, which just takes your frames per second and doubles it for the shutter speed. This produces a natural looking motion blur. As far as base ISO, I use 800 most of the time for shooting a very clean image and getting the most dynamic range at the same time. If you are shooting in low light, change the base ISO to 3200. If you are shooting in very low light, change it to 12,800. By the way, just because you change your base ISO, you still need to change the ISO setting to your desired ISO. We want to make sure that continuous autofocus is set to enable. We are shooting moving images. We want the camera to continue to autofocus as our subject moves. I like to set track after focus to on, tracking frame. You can also change your autofocus speed, just pointing that out. Under subject to detect, you can set it to people, animals, or none. Very handy. Subject detect autofocus can be set to detect priority or detect only. ABB is for doing an auto black balance. You should do this when you use the camera for the first time, sudden changes in temperature, or after changing sensor mode according to what I've read. Let's do it. I'll put my lens cap on, then press OK. Then press OK when done. You'll see settings for lens corrections. I don't usually use them, but that's up to you. This camera has digital image stabilization. It does help when shooting handheld, but I leave it off most of the time. I prefer to use lens stabilization. Now we are in the custom picture menu. For the most dynamic range, I like to set this to Canon Log 2. Next, we have the recording media setup menu page. Here's where we can format the memory cards by selecting Initialize Media. Let's do this for both cards. This erases the cards and gets them ready to shoot on. Next, we have sensor mode. We can use full frame, which I use most of the time. It uses your entire full frame lens. We also have Super 35mm cropped. This is good for using Super 35 lenses or when you want a full frame lens to be more telephoto. But the biggest reason you'd change this to Super 35 is for when you want to shoot 60 frames per second 6K raw video. This camera can only shoot up to 29.97 frames per second in RAW when it's set to full frame. That being said, in main record format, we can shoot 4K 60 frames per second full frame in non-RAW. These 10-bit settings are great for shooting in 4K log, and in my experience, are easier to edit with than RAW. because RAW uses more processing. I'll pick XF AVC YCC 422 10-bit. Under main resolution, you'll see we have a lot of options, from 4K to HD, and from intra-frame to long op. For the highest quality, I often use intra-frame 4K. For frame rate, I like 23.98 for a film look. For bitrate, you can pick 480, 360, or 240. I like 480 for the highest quality, but for high frame rate slow motion, you will have to go lower. I'll pick 240 for example. Under recording mode, I mainly use normal recording mode for shooting real-time video or slow and fast motion for shooting slow motion video. I'll leave it on slow and fast motion. Under slow and fast frame rate, I'll pick 60 frames per second for slow motion. If I go back and change the bitrate to 480, the slowest slow motion that I can record is only 30 frames per second. I can switch back to normal recording for shooting 23.98 frames per second for real speed video. Next, we have second card record function. If you just want to record on one card at a time, leave this set to off. But there are other available options where you can record proxies to the second card, or for safety, some people like to use double slot recording where everything you shoot goes to both cards at the same time. Pretty handy. Next, we are in the audio setup menu page. Let me go into audio input selection. Here you can see how your audio inputs are set up. I have input 1 and 2 using the two input terminals on the side of the camera. I'm going to change channels 3 and 4 to record the camera mic, so that if I ever disconnect my microphone, I still have the camera recording some audio using its built-in mic. Then there are a ton of audio controls that I usually just leave at default. Here's the multifunction shoe menu item where you can let the camera know what you've attached to it. Next, we have the headphone volume. Below that are the monitor channels, so you can tell the camera which inputs you want to listen to. Now we are in monitoring setup. LCD luminance is the setting you want to change if you are shooting outside on a bright day, not LCD brightness. Trust me, this monitor is plenty bright for outdoor use. Next, we have some settings for using anamorphic lenses. This next item is important. Since we are shooting in Canon Log 2, which looks nearly colorless and washed out when monitoring, we need to turn on a display LUT so that it looks normal. Don't worry, the LUT is not burned into the footage. Then under Select View Assist LCD, I'll make sure it's set to CMT 709. Now we are in assistance functions. A lot of them can be turned on and off using the assignable buttons all over the camera body. To help with focus, I'll turn on peaking. Peaking basically adds color lines, like red, over the part of the shot that's in focus to help you make sure that you are focused on the right thing. But don't worry, the lines aren't recorded into your image. I will sometimes use magnification as well to zoom into an image to check focus. But again, the zoom isn't actually burned into your footage. Black and white during magnification is something I like to turn on, so that I remember that my framing is not really zoomed in when I am magnifying an image, and then I should turn it off after I grab my focus. False color is something that I love to use for properly exposing my footage. Let's take a quick detour to show you how it's used. Basically, false color puts color all over your image representing brightness values. But again, these colors are not actually recorded. They are just there to help you nail exposure using ISO, aperture, and neutral density filters. You can also adjust shutter speed, but I usually leave that setting at 180 degrees and don't change it. You can also adjust your lighting if you are using lights when trying to get your exposure correct. There are several false colors, but you mainly need to know about 3. First is red. If parts of your image has red in it, these areas are overexposed and clipped, and you will never get that info back into your shot. Try not to clip highlights if possible. Then there's purple. Purple in your shot indicates black clipping. These are clipped underexposed areas of your shot that you will never get back. So adjust your camera if these shadow details are important to you. When exposing for skin tone, I try to adjust my ISO or ND filters or aperture so that the person's face has a small amount of pink on it. Don't forget, if you are lighting a scene, you can also adjust your lighting to get proper levels. As far as false color goes, it's pretty much that simple. Just note that sometimes a camera can't capture all the dynamic range in a shot, like if you're shooting something with a ton of contrast. Just know in these situations that you will have to decide if you are okay losing shadow or highlight information. Luckily, the C80 has plenty of dynamic range. Zebra is another tool used for properly exposing an image. You can set the zebra pattern to a certain IRE level, like 100. These zebra parts of your shot are clipped. Lower your exposure settings to avoid clipping if you can. You want the zebra pattern set at 100 to disappear. Another exposure tool is a waveform monitor. I'm going to change its size to ×2. If I press the waveform button on the camera, it pops up on the screen and it shows you the IRE levels from 0 to 100, 0 being the darkest part of the image and 100 being the brightest. There are a ton of markers that you can add to your screen to help you frame your shots. I often leave them off, but here's a grid that shows you the rule of thirds. This grid isn't burned into your image, it's just there to help you frame. You usually want your subject to be where the lines intersect, on the third of the screen, not in the dead center. But remember, rules can be broken. Next we have the Network Settings menu tab. I don't use this, so I'll skip it. This brings us to assignable buttons. This is the tab where you can change what all of the assignable buttons do. If you recall, these buttons are all over the camera. I honestly leave them all as is, but you may want to modify them. The next menu tab we have is System Setup. You'll see settings in here like time zone and date and time, things I set up when I first turned on the camera. By the way, if you're not getting a signal to your HDMI or SDI monitor, make sure you check out the output signal settings so that it's set to what your monitor can handle. Then we have timecode settings. These settings are helpful when you are using multiple cameras and a sound recorder, and you want them all to be getting the same timecode. Handy for syncing and edit later. Next we have focus ring settings that work with your connected RF lens. For fan mode, I leave it always on low speed. It keeps the camera happy and it's not that loud and does not interfere with audio recording. That's it as far as the menus go. I feel like I went over enough to get you started. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe.